So we said for this time that we would begin with a review of the various paradigms that we discussed in the previous episode.
Yeah, for the sake of thoroughness, I think it would be worth doing that. So there were 5 in total, and so the first one, I mean, there's no particular order they're in, but the first one would presumably be the New Age, kind of non-duality, woo-woo. I mean, that's quite a mocking title to use that term, woo-woo. Maybe I should leave that out, but no, the New Age paradigm is probably the best way to sum it up, and we're going to use Martin Ball as an exemplar of that paradigm.
Yeah, and just to add some associations with that paradigm, you mentioned non-duality and oneness, and they talk a lot about ego transcendence, and these are the sorts of New Age people and practitioners that we mean. So Ken Wilber is kind of a major figure in that world, though he does not really address entheogens. And so Martin Ball is quite interesting because he uses those concepts about non-duality and ego transcendence, but links it with entheogens. So I think that's why we've chosen to focus on him.
Yeah, exactly. He's the most entheogenic of all the New Age spokespeople. So the second one, I guess the neuroscience paradigm we talked about, where phenomenology is reduced to brain chemistry, and it's taken that the important action is going on at the neurophysical level, to the detriment of the phenomenological level. So that's something we'll cover in the future.
Yeah, I just saw in the news, I think is it Carhart Harris? Is that the scholar's name?
Yes.
I saw his name in the news recently about what they have for the first time scanned. They're all about scanning brain waves, and so they've for the first time scanned a brain on LSD.
I have so much to say about this. Yeah, this occupies my thoughts a lot. I mean, especially because he's a British scholar from a very prestigious university. I mean, he must be laughing, and his colleagues that are at the same level as him but not doing psychedelics must be very envious of the massive amount of media exposure that he's gained as a result of that. It's quite amazing. It's very unusual for a scholar of his level, because he's still a fairly young, fledgling scholar of neuroscience, to be given that much exposure, and it's exclusively because of his focus on psychedelics. So he's already done psilocybin in quite some depth, and it's all about brain imaging. And now, the latest headline is all about LSD.
Oh, I just wanted to add it. I was also intrigued. I haven't done much reading into it at this stage, but it seems to confirm. It seems to confirm that LSD creates a state of lucid cognition, which we kind of all knew anyway. But it seems to provide that, if what people want, if people want the hard physical evidence, it seemed to confirm that. I think they said it, loosened up. I think the language he used, or the press releases used, it loosened up all the rigid barriers that people have put up, which is kind of, maybe perhaps less articulate way of discussing mental representations and habits of thinking.
Yeah, the coverage of phenomenology is absolutely basic. It's only used as a initial rudimentary starting point to start referring to something neurophysical. You can't analyze Carhart Harris in terms of what he says about LSD and psilocybin without additionally looking at the neuroscience paradigm itself and what the underlying metaphysical assumptions that are implicit within the neuroscience paradigm, even before they start looking at psychedelic drugs. And I think that is a crucial issue to look at. It's the idea that consciousness can be reduced to or described exclusively in terms of neurophysical chemical processes.
Right, so it's very reductionist, no matter what its achievements may be.
Exactly, yeah. Its whole project is to reduce in that manner, and what Carhart Harris's work is doing is purely that same kind of reduction. And I think that it ends up being more like a language game, a word game, where he's arbitrarily talking about structures in the brain that are only fairly loose theories. They don't really correspond to anything real. We shouldn't get into this in too much depth now, but I think this is a very fruitful conversation for a later recording.
Great, I agree. Yeah, we will cover that in the future. Okay, so what else? What's the next paradigm?
So we talked about the psychotherapy paradigm. Maybe we should have put that at number 2 because that's really prominent. And in fact, a lot of Martin Ball's work kind of overlaps into the psychotherapy paradigm, I think. They talk about the healing potential, psychological healing when you trip. That a good setting for tripping is in a room with a therapist who is guiding you, or allowing you to talk about what you're experiencing, something like that. So it's very much based on the model that was initiated in the 1800s by Freud and Jung. And it's important to note that neither of them were psychedelic insiders, as far as I can tell. They created this model of a client sitting in a room with a therapist talking about their feelings, and when LSD was first discovered, it was pounced on by the psychotherapists and psychiatrists and the kind of people who employ that paradigm and who work in mental health with mentally ill people. So yeah, that involves people like Rick Doblin from MAPS, and Neil Goldsmith is another very important player in that paradigm. But yeah, there's a word associated with that paradigm, which is the word benefit. I think that sums up where they're coming from and what their expectations of psychedelia are. They want it to be some kind of benefit, but the way they characterize benefits in that context is very loose and vague and imprecise, and perhaps you could even say pseudoscientific. Like there's no measurable result. It's just a vague idea of did you recover from your trauma? Did you feel better about yourself? Something like that.
Right. Which has always been a criticism leveled against the psychotherapy since Freud started it. That it's
pseudoscience.
Yes, it's always been kind of vulnerable to that claim, because it is a subjective, kind of subjective set of, what the expectations are, and kind of almost tied into societal. I mean, you look at the sort of things. I mean, you look at Freud in his societal context and the sorts of things that he was reacting to and expected. The kind of people that he. Or what he viewed as normal, I suppose, is what I'm after. He had a specific view of what is normal that is perhaps not tied to, is tied more to cultural, is tied more to cultural context than it is to, just as any concept of normal is tied to cultural context. So it's kind of vulnerable. It's always kind of vulnerable from that critique of being pseudoscience.
Except you call it a vulnerability, but I actually think there's an argument to be made that where it concerns psychedelics, they've taken that vulnerability and turned it into a strength, because it means they don't have to account for themselves I say this in relation to comparing the psychotherapy paradigm to the ego death paradigm. I think that maybe they use the idea of vague benefits to their advantage rather than allowing that to be used against them.
Yeah, I think that's true. And they have been getting, at least in the US, a lot of good press in recent years, MAPS especially, and MAPS-funded studies. There's been last year, there was a rather high-profile, very favorable article in the New Yorker, I believe, one of the prominent New York publications, by Michael Pollan, who's a kind of popular journalist in the U.S. So
So it's gaining respectability, but at the same time, it hasn't crossed the line into legal practice in the same way that medical cannabis has. It's still there's no place where you can go as a client and legally seek this kind of psychedelic assisted therapy, as far as I know.
It seems only through sponsored studies in which the therapist and scientist has gotten a hold of the substance from the governments.
Yeah, but then I wonder, it seems like they're perpetually studying. They're perpetually doing these studies, but they're never actually coming up with the goods. And I've seen Rick Doblin talking multiple times publicly, and one of his great rhetorical strategies seems to be presenting a clock to the audience and with a countdown timer and saying, look, when this countdown timer reaches 0, that'll be the time when MDMA is legal for use in therapy. And he almost seems to have based his career on this perpetually ticking clock.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, because clocks eventually do run down. But so far nothing has happened. Okay, well, yeah, it's quite an interesting topic to discuss more, and there are assumptions about, as you said, there are assumptions about what the experiences are for, and also their model, what's the model that seems to be implied of how they would envision the end of drug prohibition.
Right.
Which seems to be a model controlled by therapists, a kind of licensed network of therapists, though we can discuss that in more detail.
Yeah, the implication being it would be illegal if it was not in that context. I think it's important to flag that up. Next paradigm in the list would be, shamanism paradigm of ayahuasca, going into the jungle. They talk about plant spirits in an animistic sense.
Mm-hmm.
And they drink really disgusting brews. And one thing that bugs me about that paradigm is that they often focus more on the unpleasant physical effects of the drugs to the neglect of the loose cog phenomenology. You hear people talking about their ayahuasca sessions, and all the emphasis is on how they vomited and shitted and whatever. And you're like, yeah, but didn't you trip? And I found with my own experiences I've tried various different plant brews. When they work, they're absolutely phenomenally brilliant, and they can induce the full range of loose cog phenomenology, but they're not as reliable as the more basic ones, basically mushrooms and LSD. Mushrooms and LSD are much more ergonomic than these plant brews, and yet this paradigm that we're talking about, the shamanism paradigm, is totally reliant on plant brews, and I think that might in some ways be a hiding place for egoic regression to some extent. They can. There's almost a Catholic attitude, or I sometimes think it might be a throwback to the 1960s when all these hippies using LSD were not taken seriously and they were mocked. And it's like the modern generation is seizing on the fact that ayahuasca and peyote, these kind of plant-based psychedelics, are in a lot of places they're legal. And they can be taken more seriously. There's an air of respectability and seriousness about them, that you only do them when you're with a shaman, and the shaman is supposed to heal you and that kind of thing. They're trying to distance themselves from I guess would say the recreational paradigm, or the idea that was created in the 60s, that people do these things to have fun. It's like the idea of having fun on ayahuasca is anathema. It's like you don't do it for that reason. You suffer when you go and do. I once did a session, and the shaman said, how funny is it? You come here, you pay us money to do this, and then you suffer, and then you go home. It's not a pleasant experience, even though it can be really, really trippy. But there's all sorts of associations as well related to that paradigm, like the way they talk about spirits, I suppose, animism. I think, because these paradigms are by no means fully circumscribed, and I think that Martin Ball, even to some small extent, he fits into this paradigm as well. He's certainly talked about, his experiences with ayahuasca a lot.
That's right, and he certainly has there's a very great seriousness to Martin Ball's work.
Right.
Yeah, that drugs are for serious spiritual exploration and awakening.
Right.
Though he is not without his humor.
Yeah.
And yeah, one thing I wanted to add about this way of approaching psychedelics is that it, I suppose we're primarily talking about, I mean, when we're critiquing, we're almost primarily addressing modern Westerners who have adopted this way of thinking and become attracted to this. It's almost like there are two different, I mean, there's the local indigenous way of doing it, or maybe version of doing it, or there's the local indigenous context, I guess is what I'm trying to introduce, and then there's the way that it's talked about in modern Western society,
right,
as this kind of rediscovery of something that we have lost in modern Western society, or never had, almost. I haven't spent a lot of time reading those books, but the ones I have kind of speak to it as something that we never had in Western society at all, or maybe had at the beginnings of it. They're willing to acknowledge some of the ancient Greek evidence, but it's kind of it's often presented as like this discovery of an age-old thing that modern people have lost or never had much in the first place.
But there's a lot of sloppy thinking and inaccurate research behind those kind of assumptions, because, for example, there's no evidence that peyote was used before the 1800s by the Native Americans. So it's not ancient. There's no good, reliable evidence, as far as I can tell, that peyote or ayahuasca are any more than a couple of 100 years old.
That's very interesting, because that kind of confirms. I mean, you encounter this with a lot of attitudes about kind of indigenous cultures that
everything they do is super ancient.
And the original thing that everyone was once doing and that everyone should be doing now in order to be authentic humans. And yeah, you see that sort of assumption or attitude in a lot of treatment of indigenous cultures, kind of denying them their own history of development in a way. But that's a larger topic.
But one other thing about that is I suspect that it comes round in full circle, because I've been to a lot of these ceremonies, and the format is you sit around in a group and then a person gives out the brew, and it's identical to the Catholic Eucharist, except that everything is in a foreign language and the bread and wine is substituted for ayahuasca. So it almost looks like it's just esoteric Christianity or esoteric Catholicism sneaking back into Western culture via this strange backdoor of South American rainforest practices, but we don't recognize it, and we think that it's something truly ancient and truly alien to us modern Westerners, but actually it's just a remnant of Catholicism and the way Catholicism spread around the world.
Well, that's very interesting. Isn't one of the main ayahuasca churches, the Santo Daime, isn't that at heart a Catholic? Or based in Catholic rituals, and that explicitly known. I mean, it doesn't involve typical Catholic icons.
Yeah, the Santo Daime are very explicit about the Christian link. And there's other examples as well, like Maria Sabina, the great mushroom shaman woman who gave Gordon Wasson mushrooms. She was a card-carrying Catholic. I mean, she didn't see mushrooms as being something to substitute for Christianity. So there's a lot of kind of maybe angles that people have missed on that. I think that the maximal entheogen theory can shed light on that in ways that current analysis of plant shamanism, maybe has missed, in terms of its relationship to ancient Western religion.
Right. Yeah, it's a kind of the great Christianity gap in entheogen studies.
Exactly.
And thinking. People are still afraid or still not committed to making that. That's still viewed as a taboo radical move by many people.
Yes.
So, and then I guess that kind of perhaps transitions into the other approach that we discussed last time was the anthropological religious history approach of, perhaps initiated by Wasson, as you mentioned, and continued for several decades by Karl Ruck. Clark Heinrich is another another name associated with this, I think.
Benny Shannon has done work in this field.
Right, though with a far better. Oh yeah, he has done work in this field. Yeah, kind of looking for historical evidence of entheogen usage.
Although, and separately to that, distinct from that, he's also done work with looking at the phenomenology of ayahuasca. There's some very interesting links to be made there. And also,
go on. No, go on.
I was going to mention Scott Titsworth.
I'm not familiar with him.
Oh no, you are. You've written about his book. Krishna in the Sky with Diamonds.
Yes. Okay, I am familiar with that. I've forgotten his name momentarily.
Right, because what really stood out to me when I was at the last Breaking Convention conference was that on the book stall they had Titsworth's book and they had like Allegro's book and Rush and Ruck and all of the and Mercure as well, all grouped together. And it just strikes me that nobody has made the further link from... Everybody's identifying individual religions. And now you've got all of the individual religions in the world. Someone has written a book about how that religion started because of entheogens. But nobody has gone on... Well, nobody other than Michael Hoffman has gone on to say that means that religion in general, or it follows from that religion in general is entheogenic.
Yeah, that's one of kind of Michael's great points about the power of theoretical and paradigmatic thinking, and not being as tied to kind of when you're generating ideas, not being as tied to evidence, and not rushing off immediately to find evidence, but simply working with the ideas. So yeah, when you look at that broad range of books, it does make total sense. But then people will say, "Oh, well, there's only evidence for this that I've spent years trying to uncover." But yeah, I suppose someone like Wasson, I think, had proposed some sort of vague, or he proposed the origin of religions came from mushroom usage or from psychedelic usage.
Yeah, because he mentioned Buddhism as well. He wrote about the founding story of Buddhism, where you've got this man Buddha being enlightened in front of a tree. Immediately prior to that, he's just eaten some kind of sacred rice pudding that some beautiful maiden has given to him. Mm-hmm. So it's the same idea that Jesus, right before he was crucified, had eaten at the Last Supper. It's eating.
So Wasson wrote about that.
Yeah, Wasson wrote about that in his book Persephone's Quest. So in other words, Wasson goes broader than simply Christianity. He didn't limit his scope, but not many other thinkers have done that. And even then, did even Wasson triangulate from that and say religion and talk about religion itself instead of talking about particular religions?
I believe that he held that the far back in the unknowable primordial past, that before any textual evidence, is kind of this very narrow, constrained position that somehow before any, before the authors got to it and concealed and tried to suppress entheogens, that the origin of religion worldwide was entheogenic use. It was entheogen use.
So he talks about that's interesting. Religion as a general term rather than particular religions.
Yes, as I recall, he does.
Right.
He talks about religion as a general term, but it at least at one point in his career he did that, and it is not a very consistent position.
Right.
Most of these religious history books have found entheogens in isolated circumstances, or perhaps asserted that one particular religion is based in entheogens.
So it's fragmented thinking with too much focus on evidence and no consciousness of underlying paradigms.
Yeah, we really need both. We need both of those things, and more so the conscious paradigm usage, paradigm-based arguing and thinking than merely evidence.
Right.
Oh, and one other one that I think identified as just with the current ways that people think about psychedelics that seem to be widespread is the drug policy reform paradigm.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Which is perhaps
So one name that's springing to mind is Ethan Nadelman, but I can't think of any other names. I can't think of any people who've written books. There was Steve Cubby. Do you know that name, Steve Cubby?
I do. The Politics of Consciousness.
That's the one. Yeah,
his book.
Maybe that's in the drug policy reform or somewhere near that paradigm.
I think so. And so these the drug policy reform paradigm is much more focused upon the legal and political status of drugs and their scheduling, and the drug laws both in individual countries and worldwide, and is more directly tied into activism, though it has its own limitations, which tend to be... there's danger of drug policy reform being, in fact, just compliant with prohibition and further extending prohibition through not critiquing prohibition radically enough.
They end up bolstering prohibition because they unconsciously adopt the same underlying assumptions that the prohibitionist mentality is based on, which is basically the idea that drugs are bad. So they try and say, oh, well, we know that drugs are bad, but still it would be better if they were legal. Whereas I guess Michael Hoffman's approach is more to call the bluff of prohibition rather than trying to pretend that you believe or subscribe to the actual idea that drugs are bad.
Yeah, and they tend to... so far, only recently have I noticed some reform nonprofits and agencies adopting a more critical view of prohibitionist laws. I mean, they're certainly critical and say, well, they haven't been effective, and so therefore we should change them, and that it's a big waste of money.
They're saying effective for the purposes of reducing drug use, as if that would be a good aim to stop people taking drugs.
That's right. So that right there buys into the kind of sidles up with the prohibitionist leaders.
So they try and say that if drugs were legal, fewer people would use drugs. I think that would be something they assume.
Yeah, I've seen people touting studies that claim that countries such as Portugal, which has decriminalized drug possession, that fewer people are using drugs, as if that were the goal, or if that were something that is going to be persuasive to prohibitionist leaders or policymakers, when in fact, I mean, just a brief comment on them, I think that they should instead, a far more effective approach is to call out the repressive nature of drug prohibition, and it's that it was not intended. The prohibitionist leaders were lying from the beginning. It was always intended as a oppressive measure meant to create certain kind of economic pathways in society and suppress certain political elements of society, such as anti-war hippies in the 60s.
And Mexicans in the early 1900s.
Yeah, Mexicans in the early 1900s, African Americans in the U.S. also in the 60s and 70s. Nixon and his advisors are on record as saying that is why they pushed the drug scheduling.
Yeah.
So I just think that the many drug policy reformers, not all, some have their heads on straighter, I think, but many are kind of chasing this, trying to defeat the beast in the wrong way.
So they assume that the prohibitionist leaders had genuine intentions to begin with, that they're honest people, rather than calling their bluff and just saying, "Come on, we know that you're lying to us," kind of approach.
Yeah, I think so. So yeah, I think that is worth discussing fully, because this sometimes overlaps with the way. Well, for example, I see some overlaps with the way that MAPS approaches drug prohibition, and that they tend to say, look, we'll work with... Their approach seems to be, well, all we want is funding for our studies, right, and to make it available for licensed therapeutic use. That's all we're asking for. They have a very kind of limited view
Yeah, never mind everybody else.
Yeah, never mind everybody else.
I think that we are bound to, as we keep on recording, we're bound to end up getting very repetitive. And I think that Michael Hoffman is very repetitive. In all this enormous amount of writing, there's actually a small number of ideas expressed in an enormous number of different ways. And I think we need to embrace that, to be really, really thorough about this. And we're already starting to repeat ourselves. It's all in the spirit of foundationalism, building a strong basis.
Building a strong basis and practice in expressing the concepts and coming up with effective ways to express them. So, was there anything else you wanted to add about these paradigms?
No, I mean, that's a pretty good comprehensive list of all of them and the crucial issues behind all of them. So for today, we were going to focus on Martin Ball as an exemplar of the New Age, non-duality style paradigm, ego transcendence type paradigm. And this is a really obvious place to start, I think, because it's already very well-worn territory. Like, you've already written about Martin Ball. Michael Hoffman has already written about Martin Ball in great detail. So this has already been said, a lot of what we're already saying. We're just trying to sum it up as best as we can in this particular format. But something that, when I was researching into this, it did occur to me that there's two distinct things here that we are addressing. One is Martin Ball, the whole person, in terms of his whole presentation. And another thing is a very distinct theory that he is proposing, the entheological paradigm. And I think there's a lot more to Martin Ball than just the entheological paradigm. When I first became aware of Martin Ball, I got two of his books, his very early books, before he'd ever started talking about these grand, all-encompassing theories. One of them was called Mushroom Wisdom, and one was called Salvia something. Anyway, one book all about mushrooms and one book all about salvia. And from one thing that has really always struck me about Martin Ball is he seems to stick two fingers up to prohibition. He just doesn't seem to give a damn that these things are illegal, even to the extent that he talks very publicly, like on the internet, about offering shaman-type services involving illegal chemicals to people who are his followers. So it's quite remarkable how he's managed to achieve that, whilst at the same time, holding down a professional career and having those kind of responsibilities and having a family and that kind of thing. So I take my hat off to him for that. I mean, I think...
I agree. I much admire, it is rather shocking to see how open he is in some ways, and that he hasn't encountered that much suppression, that we obviously don't know what challenges he may have faced. I mean, he has some more background on him. He has a PhD in religious studies, in which he studied, I believe, modern shamanistic community, and for his dissertation, which I believe was also published by an academic press. And then he is also published, and you can visit his website to see a number of these books. So both the kind of practical guidebooks or how-to books on mushrooms and salvia that Max mentioned, and also then a variety of books on this grander paradigm that he's been promoting, the entheological paradigm, as well as some transcriptions with his podcast interviews. So he's a rather prolific podcaster on topics related to psychedelics and spirituality.
And fiction as well. He writes pure fiction.
He has written fiction and published that. He, as you mentioned, holds down a career as a adjunct professor at a university in the Western U.S. He is a musician as well, a visual artist.
Right. In terms of his being a professor, I don't think that he incorporates his entheogenic study into his professorship. I would be very surprised if he did that. Like, I don't think that he lectures people about entheogens in the establishment he works for.
No, I'm not certain about that, but I would be surprised about that as well, especially as someone who is not kind of protected by the tenured system. I would be surprised if he had that much leeway.
Is that what the adjunct means?
So the adjunct is perhaps they don't use this term. Yeah, there are different terms in the UK. So the adjunct is someone who is not tenured nor is on the track to being tenured.
Oh, I
but
see.
Is a sort of part-time professor who is hired for a class or two a semester.
Oh, right.
And this is a kind of growing feature of many universities and colleges in the US, though is a rather... Well, anyway, there's lots of problems with it as a workforce.
Yeah, it sounds like casual labor.
It is, yes. Many universities are very eager to increase the number of adjuncts because it's far cheaper than hiring and protecting full professors. But unfortunately, a number of career academics are forced really to go that route for various reasons. And yeah, as you mentioned, he's kind of a part-time therapist as well. I've heard some descriptions he's given on his podcasts of therapy sessions he's held with, as he calls them, the medicines.
Right.
And then he presents regularly at conferences and also organizes conferences. And in fact, I think as of this recording date, I think a week ago or 2 weeks ago, there was a conference held in the Western U.S., held by Martin Ball.
Oh, what was that called?
I think it's called Exploring Psychedelics. The second or third, in fact, conference that he has put on.
So he's clearly a very highly motivated individual in this domain, the domain of entheogens.
Yes, it seems to be. Yeah, he seems to be kind of a amazing entrepreneur in some ways.
But why he's of particular interest to us is because he claims to have formulated a comprehensive systematic theory of ego transcendence, which starts to sound a lot like what Michael Hoffman has done with the ego death theory. I'd like to read out one quote, which is quite, I guess, for him, the foundation of his thinking along these lines. So Martin Ball said, "The level of individual awareness and responsibility that the entheological paradigm provides is unprecedented in human history, as it offers a direct and immediate route for each individual to directly experience and understand him or herself as an embodiment of God. Incomparable to any other method or technique, the entheological paradigm is fundamentally unique."
Mm-hmm.
And I think that shares some features in common with the ego death theory, but then it distinguishes itself from other theories. Distinguishes itself from the ego death theory in terms of how much it incorporates the older system. So with the ego death theory, it claims to explain the older systems of spirituality and religion and mythology and that kind of thing. Whereas for Martin Ball, he wants to burn the bridges to all of those old systems and say, look, this is fundamentally, radically modern and unique. And I think ego death theory has that modernness and uniqueness in the sense that it's a system, it's an explicit systematization of these older systems. But Martin Ball doesn't attempt to explain the older systems in terms of the entheological paradigm in the way that Hoffman does.
Yeah, he. I think that's a good point about Martin Ball's thinking about entheogens and the ego. So he doesn't claim to explain religion. More so he claims that it is that his way of approaching entheogens and the ego is better than previous religious systems and other current active metaphysical, what he dubs kind of metaphysical New Age systems. And yeah, so there's a strong sense of dismissal of other systems and other ways of approaching the ego. He in fact has published, he's published kind of critiques of other modern psychedelic thinkers claiming that they are projecting ego delusions, delusions based upon the fact that they retain their ego, in Martin Ball's way of putting it.
Does he give specific examples of that?
Yeah, he has published an article I saw on the Reality Sandwich website,
right.
critiquing Terence McKenna and McKenna's description of machine elves, which is how he characterized his DMT experiences. And Martin Ball's also produced other critiques of McKenna's 2012 thinking.
He seems to see McKenna as a main target or a main competitor for this niche.
Mm-hmm. This kind of niche of psychedelic philosophy.
Yeah.
I think that's right. But his main complaint about McKenna and critique is that he sees McKenna as projecting out ego delusion is the term he keeps coming back to. McKenna projects out his ego delusions and claims that entities exist which do not exist, and that seems to be Ball's main critique of prior religious systems and of other New Age systems. Ball would, in fact, kind of, I think, object to us lumping him with New Age, which he says, I'm not doing New Age things because I don't claim that the entheogen experience reveals any other entities out there. There's no other entities, Martin Ball would say. There's only the one entity.
So he's suggesting that what New Age does is postulate entities unnecessarily.
Yeah, there's no spirits out there. He's a great criticizer in some places of other entheogenists and modern entheogenic spirituality. Because he says there's no spirits out there, there's no machine elves out there. All that is a projection. Anyone claiming that is a projection, and they just don't understand the fundamentally non-dual nature of reality. So for Martin Ball, the high point of entheogenic experiencing is fully taking on and experiencing, as you said in that quote, experiencing oneself as God, and kind of letting go is a term he uses a lot. Letting go of your ego, which is for him what prevents us from experiencing ourselves as God.
Your separate identity is ego, right?
Yeah, so he contends that that entheogens reveal the nature of reality, which he says is God, that all of reality is God, and that everything that exists is God, and in fact the only thing that exists is God.
Can I read out a quote directly from Martin Ball that I've got here? He says, "All of reality, including all life and consciousness, is the manifestation of a unitary energy being. In the simplest terms, everything that exists is God. There is nothing that is not God." That actually does start to sound a little like block universe, block time idea, except that he seems to be taking the universe in a freeze frame in the present moment, and he doesn't take into account temporal extension, past and future.
Yeah, I think that's right. He doesn't seem to talk about time much, which is a key component of the ego death theory, that the entheogen experiencing and psychedelic experiencing is primarily about, or is most powerfully about
changing your model of time.
Yeah, that we switch from a open future view of time to a closed future experience of time. And Martin Ball doesn't seem to cover that at all. Instead, he is entirely focused on this idea of energy, and that everything is a manifestation of an energetic pattern. He talks a lot about fractals, and claims that he is, I guess one way that he distinguishes himself from other religious systems and from other New Age systems is he claims that he is relying upon fractal mathematics, which I'm not very familiar with fractal mathematics, but this, from what I gather, Max, I don't know how familiar you are with fractals.
They're recursively defined functions. So functions that are defined in terms of themselves. So when you visually represent a fractal, it's infinitely complex, because no matter how much you zoom into it, it's just it's kind of like a feedback loop. It's a spiral is a very basic fractal pattern that no matter how much you zoom in, you've always got new layers of pattern. I don't personally see much, any kind of connection, any hook between that and psychedelic phenomenology. So I must say that I'm impressed. I always strikes me that you seem to resonate with Ball's theory of energy, whereas whenever I hear it, I mentally tune out when I hear him start talking about energy. It doesn't mean anything to me. But when you hear him say that everything is a pattern of energy, what do you think that means in terms of determinism or something like that?
Well, I've been struggling with that, and since we decided to discuss Martin Ball's theory, I've been struggling with how to reconcile that with the ego death theory. And I guess that, from listening to some of Martin Ball's podcasts, he describes one particular awakening experience, as he puts it, in which he perceived fractals and also perceived that was a representation of ultimate reality. And a lot of his visual artwork incorporates fractals into them.
Right, so fractals look like the kind of trippy visuals that you see under the influence of psychedelics, definitely.
And I think, now, I did a bit of just preliminary investigations into fractal mathematics. I'm no mathematician, but nonetheless, I guess the man most associated with discovering fractals or systematizing fractal mathematics as an abstract mathematical concept.
What, Mandelbrot?
Frenchman. Yeah, Mandelbrot, is it?
Yeah, Mandelbrot. He did the Mandelbrot set, which is one particular fractal, which is very familiar. It gets reproduced a lot.
So then he also, in addition to this, kind of more pure mathematics work, he then also started to apply it or claim that patterns within nature reflect fractal equations or fractal mathematics.
Yeah, there's like a type of broccoli you can get, which has got a very striking fractal pattern on it.
And you see some proponents of this claiming that everything in nature can be explained by fractals, kind of, the classical Euclidean geometry of squares, triangles, circles, that those don't really exist in nature. A mountain is not a cone; it's a imperfect cone. Mm-hmm. And Mandelbrot and some of his followers claim that fractal mathematics can account for mountains and account for river patterns and things like that.
I see. So that everything is mathematical, even imperfect shapes.
Yes, and so I think that's the kind of that's what Martin Ball bases a lot of his claims on. This crowd of people saying that fractal mathematics is inherent in nature. I've seen some, I've also seen even proponents of the fractal mathematics use more cautious language than I think Martin Ball would, and say that, the patterns of fern development seem to appear or seem to correlate with a fractal equation.
But only at one level of zoom. That it doesn't continue to be. The whole point of fractals is that you can continue to zoom in. Whereas when you see a fractal broccoli, it's only fractal at that level of magnification.
That's right. So there's no, Martin seems to be relying on the more fervent of the mathematicians or fervent popularizers of fractal mathematics and saying that everything is fractal and that God is essentially a fractal energetic pattern.
There's one very prominent theorist in this domain called Nassim Haramein. Do you know that name?
No, I'm not familiar.
I think that might crop up in a future podcast because he's tangentially relevant to some of these issues. But his whole thing is about the universe is fractal and the modern scientific paradigm is getting it all wrong by not recognizing this. So maybe there's some influence there, or I would be surprised if Martin Ball was not aware of Nassim Haramein's work, because it sounds that they use the same terminology.
So, but I think it's, Martin's reliance upon this fractal mathematics, is a large part of this uniqueness criteria.
Oh, right.
Because he says, well, I'm basing it on, we know, everyone agrees that, that the universe is fractal energy. So he takes that as kind of completely a given.
But I don't even see, there's not even any mathematics on his, I've never seen him actually employing mathematical techniques in any form whatsoever. So I'm surprised that he would use mathematics as such a strong basis for his ideas.
Yes, I was surprised as well, actually, based upon earlier exposure to his kind of tangential exposure to his work, to then see that kind of dead center in his claims that that what you're experiencing on entheogens is that you become aware of this nature of reality which you're previously not aware of.
Right.
So I think that's kind of that's some of the basis of some of his claims, is that on entheogens you become aware of this true nature of reality which you were previously unaware of. Now I think that from the ego death theory perspective, I think we would just say that that energy is simply that this energy that Martin Ball describes is, on the one hand, can be understood as the state of loose cognition and the kind of the radical, the various phenomenological effects of the entheogenic state are caused by the loosening of our representations of the world around us, of what our senses are, not the world around us, what our senses are, what's being presented to our senses. In the loose cog state, there's a kind of blurring or change to that, and so I think you could kind of redescribe the energy as that. I also. You said I kind of resonate more with the energy, and it's really just out of trying to get a sense, fully understand more where Martin's coming from. But I also, I have to admit, my eyes slightly glaze over at the talk of energy, and then how it's further deployed in Martin's therapeutic work. He talks a lot about, you need to align your energy properly, and that's the goal of work with entheogens.
Right. I think you clarified for me just now why you equate energy with loose cog. I think that makes sense about revealing this hidden layer to things. But what resonated more with me is another way that he describes non-duality is in a very concrete sense, concrete physicalist sense of saying, like, as I sit at my desk, I perceive myself and my computer as two separate objects. And the insight of non-duality is that on this hidden underlying level, I'm actually not separate from my computer screen. I'm not separate from the seat I'm sitting on. But in doing that, he's reducing identity to physical bodily identity, which ignores the cybernetic aspect of identity. And again, he's also seems to be turning the physical world into he's kind of capturing it in a freeze frame and only focusing on the present moments rather than, again, incorporating the idea of temporal extension.
Yeah, and I think he would almost say, it's funny because we're kind of charging Martin Ball with ignoring time and ignoring the temporal dimension of entheogenic experiencing. And, I think, what we really mean by that is, the sensation of closed future determinism or eternalism, and the, fully taking on that way of thinking or grasping that presents a serious challenge to our sense of self in kind of Martin's language, or identity. And I think he in turn would reply that we are, I can imagine him taking on the ego death theory and saying that, well, you're just hanging on to your egos and you've just got to learn to relax and let go. He describes the ego primarily as he describes it as a set of energetic patterns. Again, all this energy talk. So he tries to link the ego to his kind of the physics that he's adopted. He claims the ego is a set of energetic patterns, but also that the ego is primarily that which gives humans their self-awareness or self-consciousness or sense of personal identity. I think these are the sorts of terms he uses.
Yeah.
And then at other times he will also describe the ego in a pretty loaded way as that which prevents awakening to non-duality.
Right.
So it's either kind of vaguely or simply self-consciousness or self-awareness, but then also he calls it, in a much more biased way, that which prevents awakening to non-duality, which kind of points to his paradigm.
So he sets up the concept of ego to bolster the paradigm.
Yeah, that the ego is what prevents us from all the time being in a non-dual state of consciousness. And he also ties us in, there's just certain vulnerabilities. I mean, just to return briefly to the energy fractal stuff, there's some vulnerabilities to that. It really rests upon, Martin's claiming that when you work with entheogens, you experience the true nature of reality. There's kind of an ontological claim that he says when you trip out, you are in fact experiencing the true nature of reality, not just a set of experiences or phenomenological phenomena. But that, you're really fully experiencing the true nature of reality, and that.
So, in other words, the way that the entheological paradigm captures that is a propositional truth.
Yes. Yeah. And that,
Because that's distinctly not what you would say about the ego death theory in terms of pragmatic truth and accurate modeling.
Yeah, that's right. I think the ego death theory simply says that there are different mental models available to us, and that in the entheogen state we have a certain set of experiences or range of experiences, and then we construct intellectually a world model to explain those experiences.
Right, so he's not making reference to an objective truth. He's just making reference to two subjective mental world models that you switch between.
Right, this is Michael Hoffman in the ego death theory.
Yeah.
Whereas Ball claims that, Ball kind of, it's almost like kind of, it has some relationships, or some relationship to, or similarity to, I think, what you see in Gnostic texts, where the present world is a illusion of some sort, and that the true nature of reality is something else, something that's not presented to us. So there is a true nature of reality that is somehow hidden from us on a regular basis, and that we get access to that through working with entheogens and learning to trust and let go of the ego, which prevents us from, the ego as our sense of a separate self, prevents us from experiencing that all the time.
But how would you say he modeled the return to the ordinary state after the entheogenic altered state? Is he saying, like, what would he say about what you retain versus what you don't retain? Because you don't retain the altered state, but you do retain the world model according to Hoffman's model, even though the world model is only it only becomes an abstraction when you're not actually in the loose cog state of consciousness. You can still have eternalism as an intellectual mental model, even if you're not tripping. I wonder how Ball's theory corresponds to that issue of you get something when you enter into loose cog, and then you retain part of that, but you lose part of that as well. I wonder if he can accurately model for that.
Well, actually, I dug up a quotation here from his overview website on the entheological paradigm, that the goal is to maintain your center in an ego-transcended state and be fully present at all times, not just when working with entheogens. Which sounds a lot like it sounds like he does want to have the altered state at all times.
Is it that he wants to have the altered state, or just some kind of higher state of attention, or higher state of, like, because it starts to sound like the mindfulness idea. Like, it's a very trendy thing in meditation at the moment to talk about mindfulness, cultivating mindfulness, and it sounds like he's talking about that, about having an increased sense of present attention.
Oh, I see. Yeah, this links into what you're saying about his focus on the present, the now, which is very trendy, and mindfulness. And
Eckhart Tolle is quite a good example of that style of thinking. And so it's not that he's trying to say that you retain the altered state permanently, because that would be blatantly false modeling, right? He's trying to say that it gives you an enhanced ability to maintain your present awareness, is how I interpret that. But then that starts to sound like a benefit, quote unquote, that he's trying to bring in.
Yeah, I think that's right. He also says well, I'm paraphrasing here. He almost seems to say, learn that you really are God or energy, and then learn through entheogenic work or working in the altered state to be in harmony with that kind of inner God and energy. And then once you do that, you can then make your choices in regular life, I guess, non-altered state work, from that standpoint of being in harmony with God energy.
And that at that point, it crucially reveals that Martin Ball is not talking about a transformation in your model of cybernetic agency. He's saying that you retain your free will before and after enlightenment. I found a quote where he specifically says, each individual is also completely autonomous and has free will to choose within the energetic limits of reality. So I think that reveals that at the core in his thinking, he is a possibilist. So his own model of agency has not been transformed, even though a lot of what he says about unified energy does sound like this cybernetic non-control deterministic model. At the end of the day, he's not really that's not really what he believes. He believes in a possibilist type framework where you can choose between multiple outcomes, multiple possibilities. It's just that you can do that either from an unenlightened state of not being present awareness, or from a enlightened state of knowing about loose cog, the non-dual experience, and being that much more inclined to be presently aware than you were before.
Yeah, it tips over, as you said, at that point, and puts its focus on ordinary state life,
right,
in the end. And this falls into his work as a therapist, and you can read, I kind of skimmed over sections where he talks about, there's he recommends different postures to adopt, different ways of standing, the physical ways of standing to adopt, to align oneself with one's inner energy. So he kind of starts adopting as if there are actions that you can do that would affect or better reflect your the entheogenic state. When in contrast, as we've been saying, the ego death theory doesn't ask you to do anything to understand it. It's more about understanding the concepts and the world model, it recommends testing and experiencing that world model, but it doesn't ask you to take on to do anything differently. And in fact acknowledges that you may go on being kind of dysfunctional in your everyday life after ego death, enlightenment, and transcendence.
You might be disappointed with enlightenment.
Yeah. You might be disappointed. What's the old? There's that old. I think it's an old Zen saying about before enlightenment carry water and after enlightenment carry water. That I think I heard from Michael at one point, but it's
that's right. They say chop wood, carry water.
Oh, chop wood, carry water. Yeah, and then do the same thing afterwards.
Exactly. Yeah, because that's a very very persistent fallacy, the idea that enlightenment must entail that when you're enlightened, you're sitting on a white cloud with a flock of angels attending to your every need, and that you don't have to deal with modern life anymore.
Yeah, that's right. And I think this is where, for all of Martin saying that he is not a New Age person, and his paradigm is not a New Age paradigm, it really looks very similar to what many modern Western New Age proponents are claiming or offering. This is the sort of thing, it seems to me Ken Wilber is after. Andrew Cohen, who was one of Ken Wilber's associates, ran a kind of facility in the Northeast for a number of years until there was a great falling out a few years ago. He, these are always the grand claims that once you get enlightenment, then you will lead a blissed out, happy experience forever and ever. And that if you don't, if you don't continue to feel blissed out, then you have failed in some way. And you need to do more work and keep partaking in whatever work we're offering you.
So it perpetuates itself with completely ridiculous, unrealistic expectations of what enlightenment ought to be about.
That's a great topic, what enlightenment ought to be about. And I think that that's almost an unstated part or assumption of Martin Ball's theory of what is enlightenment about. And the way he presents it, too, he presents it as it ties again into his sense that what he is presenting is the true nature of reality. And to hear him talk about his awakening, it seems that that's how he views his own experience, that he took this 5-MeO-DMT and experienced encountering the true nature of reality and that it was God, and he has been kind of off on this journey ever since then. Yeah, that ties into him not being very tuned into mental world models and him not viewing the altered state in terms of a distinct mental world model that overlaps in some ways with ordinary state life, but there's not kind of a universal application of the altered state to the ordinary state. There may be applications to it, but that's kind of really dependent, I think, on each individual and not upon... I'm not sure you can theorize about that in the same way that you can theorize about the eternalism model of time and the relationship of trust between lower and higher controllers in the altered state of consciousness.
You're saying you can't theorize as accurately about what comes after, about any potential benefit or change that might come after.
I think that's right. I think that's so dependent upon each individual's experience and their current station in life. What sort of benefit do they want? What do they want out of their life experience? I'm not sure it just doesn't seem there's much profit in, I don't know. There doesn't seem there's much profit in trying to identify or come up with a set of, they seem so tied to cultural context, any benefits that could be derived from any practical day-to-day benefits beyond kind of intellectual comprehension and, perhaps relief of tension about the nature of control systems in the self.
It's something I've often wondered about myself in my own context, because it definitely seems to me like psychedelics made my life a whole lot better and a whole lot more interesting, although there was a point for a time when I was really traumatized and messed up, and I felt exactly the opposite of that. But in the long run, it's been nothing but positive in the sense of how I attribute positivity to it. I wouldn't prefer to go back in time and never take drugs, but on the other hand, it's not a specific thing. It's just that I discovered something that turned out to be really interesting and a big focus of my life. But I couldn't really say that it healed my soul in a particular way that I could characterize.
Yeah, beyond the sort of metaphorical sense that the soul is our ego or control system, which is, wounded in some way and is healed by, contact with a higher controller or something like that.
Right, so healing purely in the metaphorical sense of how it fits in with ego transcendence.
Yeah, and I think this is, you said that Martin Ball somewhat overlaps into the plant shamanism world, and I think that this is also an aspect of the plant shamanism world, and that modern Westerners tend to misread some of the claims of healing made by shamans.
Well, misread, or the actual shamans themselves seem to be deliberately misinforming, because Maria Sabina was directly quoted as saying, people do mushrooms when they are ill, in the physical sense of being ill, and they come to mushrooms to get better. I've never really understood the claims that these indigenous type people make about why they do psychedelics in the first place. I went to Peru and drank ayahuasca out there, and I still didn't understand. And they just talk in this very vague sense about healing and plant spirits and that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, you raise an interesting point about the plant spirit paradigm. That do the shamans themselves believe in the physical healing, or are they misunderstanding the entheogenic experience? Have they not brought on the metaphorical understanding in their day-to-day thinking? Are they what is their role in their society? Does their social role in their society rely upon them, the idea that they really are providing physical healing? I think that's a possibility. And then there's also the dynamic of, the ways that indigenous peoples in the Americas and in other parts of the world have learned to deal with modern Westerners coming to them.
Yes, of course. This is some very complicated issues here around that really call into question what it looks like on the surface when you hear the way they talk about it.
Yeah, like what do you say to the white man, sort of thing. How do you interact with them given all of the history and everything like that? What relationship do you have with them, and how do you talk to them?
You can't take things too literally when you read the language that is used around those things. I mean, it's not so much related to Ball because he's not so strongly affiliated with this particular paradigm, although he has talked about drinking ayahuasca with Santo Daime. So he's definitely been involved in this and had some experience of it.
He has, and I guess we brought it up because of the talk of healing and benefit.
Yes, yeah.
So, but I think maybe to return to what we were hitting on the point about the therapeutic the therapeutic goals of Ball's work. Yeah, we were claiming that Ball wants to maintain. Yeah, he views entering the altered state. Kind of the goal of that is to obtain a certain kind of stability in one's everyday life. He uses the word harmony.
Right.
He wants to help people be in harmony with their own inner energy, which I guess I want to kind of swing things more into his claims about what the ego is, and kind of going off of this harmony. He tends to see the ego as because I think defining exactly what the difference between Ball's conceptions of the ego and the way that the ego death theory presents the ego, I think that could be really beneficial. And kind of good exercise because Ball presents the ego, as we said, as a self-awareness and that which prevents awakening to non-duality.
Yeah.
He also, I found him talking about the ego as a filter.
That comes from Huxley's kind of terminology.
The filter, is that right?
Yeah, Huxley talked about the reducing valve of consciousness, and the doors of perception are muddied, they're dirty, and you clean them with loose cog. And it's talking about ego as a filter. It's the same idea that then when you take psychedelics, you diminish ego, and therefore the filter is reduced. So you get more coming in, more input.
So that's the kind of origin of this idea. The ego is a block or obstruction to awakening to non-duality.
It filters out this information about the fractal nature of things, so you are prevented from seeing that.
He also describes the ego as he describes it as that through which you repress your own inner energy.
Oh, okay. That's starting to sound Freudian.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, you shared with me some time ago a video he gave, a presentation he gave, a video of the presentation he gave at the Breaking Convention conference.
That's right, yeah.
In which he includes that definition. The ego is the interface that regulates energy from outside and energy from inside, but also the ego is the way that we edit the natural energy we feel and that this then produces our actions, or this kind of editing process.
Okay. That starts to sound quite cybernetic when he's talking about it as a determiner of action.
Yes, and so I think that this is, it's kind of this area where Ball kind of comes closest to focusing on agency and decision making. But the ego is the thing through which we make our decisions, which is fully where the ego death theory puts its definition of what the ego is. And it took me a while to understand in my own history of learning about the ego death theory is that this focus on the ego as a center of agency, or the supposed center of agency, is that focus on agency is what separates really the ego death theory from other or from New Age theories like Ken Wilber's focus on ego transcendence, and in a way Martin Ball's work here, that there's Yeah, Hoffman's focus on the ego as agency is really that is the most important thing about the ego, and the most important thing about so-called ego death.
I've often wondered why that is the case, and how you could exactly justify the claim that the most important aspect of egoic identity is related to self-control and not to self-awareness in the passive sense of just being aware without having to do anything.
You've often wondered how Michael Hoffman can make that claim.
Yeah, so in other words, if I came across a post on a forum and somebody said, well, I don't believe that, I think the self-awareness aspect of ego is more important than the fact that ego is a self-controller, I'm not sure I would know how to say, no, that's wrong, Michael Hoffman doesn't think that. I'm not sure I can build an argument from the ground up to justify that, why there should be the more emphasis on the cybernetic aspect of ego.
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't thought about rehearsing those arguments recently. And
it links into the general way that I perceive the ego death theory as being related to Platonism. That kind of issue really relates to that for me, because Platonism doesn't put any emphasis on self-control. It's just bare metaphysics. I mean, we're going miles beyond the topic of Martin Bull now, but it's something that we could come back to maybe.
Yeah, I'd be very interested in discussing Platonism more in the future, because certainly when you look at something like this Socratic dialogues, I think that there is a lot of emphasis on at least action and agency and decision making.
Oh, okay.
Because, for example, in all of those, you see Socrates reducing his interlocutors, the people he's dialoguing with, to a state of not knowing what to do. And he kind of induces in them this state of not being sure what action to take. So there's a focus there, I think.
Oh, you're talking about the narrative structure. I was referring to the metaphysical structure of the model, regardless of how it's communicated. But no, I do take your point that aspect of this dialogue is the Socratic dialogue does start to look that way.
I see. Yeah. Well, we can maybe perhaps devote an episode to Platonism in the future.
I mean, about Martin Bull, there was one other very important issue that I wanted to raise. I mean, I don't know if you had, unless you had anything else to say about what we have been talking about, energy and that kind of thing. I wanted to talk about his emphasis on 5-MeO-DMT and then this minor involvement with Santodaime and plant-based concoctions. I think it reveals something about how his theory is shaped the way it is, and it links into his attitude towards the bad trip control loss phenomenon. Is very important to register that. He does acknowledge it, but only in a very tepid and fleeting way. He doesn't want to dwell on the topic of bad trips, but he can't deny that they exist. So he kind of sidesteps it and puts much more focus on the positive, pleasant aspect of psychedelic tripping. And I think that could be strengthened by his reliance on 5-MeO-DMT, because have you ever smoked 5-MeO-DMT or NN-DMT?
I have not, no.
Oh, right, okay, because it's very different thing from oral ingestion. In fact, Michael Hoffman just posted about this yesterday, but he was talking about cannabis. But if you ingest entheogens by the lungs, which you can only do with a small number, NN-DMT, 5-MeO-DMT, a couple of others, the experience never lasts very long. And I think that a crucial component of the really full, traumatizing, harrowing control loss experience is its duration. And you don't get that with these smokable tryptamines. A good analogy for it is like watching a trailer for a movie compared to watching the movie itself. And I think that smoking DMT is much more akin to watching a trailer. It doesn't give you the full experience because you can't have your mental world model, melted down thoroughly and then reformulated in the space of a 10-minute rush of tryptamine visions. And it's not to say that can never happen, or me personally, I've had a lot of experimentation with smoking NN-DMT, And I can honestly say I've never had like a really powerful, devastating control loss type experience. Whereas when I do LSD or mushrooms, that's fairly common to have some kind of struggle, tough experience. I just don't get that with the smokable tryptamines. And so I think it's important to look for hiding places where egoic thinking and avoidance of control loss can enter into a person's thinking. And I think that it does enter into Martin Ball's thinking in this regard. That he says about 5-MeO-DMT that it's so much more special and better than any of the other entheogens. But I don't agree with that. I would much rather utilize Hoffman's general way of thinking that entheogens all belong in one category, and give or take, more or less, they're all approximately equivalent. But I certainly wouldn't put 5-MeO-DMT, and I certainly wouldn't put it in that form of being smoked and therefore not having a long duration. I wouldn't raise the status of 5-MeO-DMT in the way that Martin Ball does.
I agree that he paints himself into a corner by excessively focusing and elevating 5-MeO-DMT. Although he just says that he calls it the entheological paradigm, and he pays some lip service to other entheogens. He will also kind of point out that unless people have experience with 5-MeO-DMT, they can't really know what he's talking about. So I view this as really a great limitation, because it seems like he's just constructing a theory about 5-MeO-DMT experiencing, but that theory could be trumped by, easily by a broader theory of psychedelic experiencing. So I agree with that, and it seems to me that my impression from listening to him describe his own story is that he had this strong experience on 5-MeO-DMT that was significant to him, and then started his theorizing from there, despite his interest already in other psychedelics and other entheogens. His theory about energy, I think, is kind of based in this DMT, this 5-MeO-DMT world specifically, and he makes some claims that 5-MeO-DMT is found within our brains naturally, and that ingesting 5-MeO-DMT kind of activates what's in our brains already. And I think that this claim that it's already in our brains is significant for understanding his model, because this presence of 5-MeO-DMT within our brains naturally allows him to claim that, or it supports in a way his claim that everything is one, because the 5-MeO-DMT is already in our brains, and so all we're doing is just kind of activating that more and allowing us to perceive more of what it already allows us to perceive.
It's interesting because it's actually a false claim, or at least it would be a false claim if he said that it has been scientifically conclusively established that there's DMT in the brain, because it hasn't. There was one experiment that was done on the human brain, and it was methodologically flawed. I think it's been confirmed that you can find DMT in rats, but never in humans. That's a very widespread misconception about the science of DMT. I think it remains to be seen whether there's DMT in human beings or not.
Right, so just as we see here how his theory relies upon some claims based in science, and so it kind of has this air of being based in science, just as the fractal mathematics gives it the air of being based in science and reality and truth, when in fact these claims may not be accepted, in fact, or not be based upon, the fractal is not, it's a closer approximation to what happens in nature, but it certainly, as you said, it doesn't work at all levels, and that the fractals do their own thing in abstract and different things in nature.
So he's poorly researched in a lot of areas, and he relies on this air of it's kind of an appeal to authority first of all in mathematics with the fractal thing, and then also in what was the other thing, the appeal to the authority of
the 5-MeO-DMT within the brain,
of the scientific idea that there's 5-MeO-DMT in the brain, which turns out not to even be true anyway. So it's a weak foundation to base to lean on if you're trying to establish a theory, some kind of vague scientific or mathematical ideas.
There's another one I just wanted to add too, is that there's an element, especially when he presents his theory to people, there's an element of, he relies upon evolutionary claims.
Right.
He says that the universe created it different levels of consciousness in various creatures in order for it to experience itself more fully.
So the way it sees itself evolves over time. Is that what the implication is?
And he claims that humans are the kind of pinnacle of evolution in this way, and that they have self-consciousness, and that no other creatures have self-consciousness, and that so humans are unique in this way, and difficult in this way too, because then they get out of whack with, they both become. They're both, he says they're both unique in that they can become self-aware, but the self-awareness is in fact a detriment to them, because then they get out of whack with the universal God energy that is all around them,
right,
and within them. And so, but again, it has this air, and people have challenged him. I saw a presentation or heard a podcast where somebody challenged him about this, and he said, "Well, that's just that's what I've heard." So he has to kind of wave his hands in order to keep going. And so I think that besides relying upon these kind of vaguely scientific authority ideas, another issue or vulnerability I see in Ball's theory is that the grandness of the claims that you really are experiencing the true nature of reality, that you are, you've got to take on board a lot when you adopt the Martin Ball paradigm.
Like you have to accept a lot of new facts.
Yeah, you've got to accept a lot of, and in a lot of different areas of life. And I guess that's one appeal that we mentioned before of the ego death theory is that it simply asks you to learn a mental world model about time and self, and at its core. Now there are other aspects of the ego death theory, claims about religious history and about mythology, that are not central to the Hoffman's so-called phase 2, that are not central to the entheogenic experiencing, but kind of follow along from it and are related to it. But certainly the core of understanding entheogenic experiencing in the ego death theory is rather small and kind of easy to take on board. It's focused on cognitive science and phenomenology.
So then how would you contrast Ball in terms of what he's asking you to take on board?
Well, as I said, he asks you to take on board a lot of kind of scientific world model, and a certain version of modern science, which, so his paradigm starts to, in that way, kind of live and die on scientific studies
that are not actually directly involved in the theory anyway.
Yes, I agree. There's a lot of extra things attached to his theory, which gives it this kind of woo factor. He's
being too ambitious in terms of what he's trying to achieve.
I think so. I think he's overextended a bit, and it makes his theory a little kind of awkward.
It's like physicists tout this grand unified theory of absolutely everything that they're one day going to come up with, and it's like maybe Ball is trying to do that a bit too much. He's trying to work out too much.
Yeah, I mean, he claims to. At some point on his overview website of the entheological paradigm, he claims that he is also one-upping science, modern science, because he claims to explain where consciousness comes from and life comes from.
In similar to how he's kind of claiming that he's one-upping religion and spirituality as well.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We wandered away from that topic. But yeah, he claims that he's one-upped all of those things as well.
I wanted to make one other point about the 5-MeO-DMT thing, is I think there's a certain element of artificial scarcity, which is a tactic that you could say the Catholic Church has used in trying to say that mystical experiences are a lot rarer than they actually are. And I think that maybe there's partly to do with the fact that 5-MeO-DMT is actually pretty difficult to get hold of. It's not possible to create it in a typical home environment, which actually contrasts it with NN-DMT. You can't just make it in a kitchen. So relatively few people, by generally speaking, relatively few people are going to be able to get hold of 5-MeO-DMT. And I think maybe on some level Martin Ball is aware of that, and he's trying to say that part of the mystique of 5-MeO-DMT is owing to its rareness in the world.
That's a really interesting point, and I think we're identifying or revealing some of the social dynamics of Ball's theorizing.
I think that part of Ball's angle involves the fact that 5-MeO-DMT is relatively scarce because you cannot create or extract 5-MeO-DMT in a typical kitchen, which actually contrasts it to the other form of DMT, which Ball explicitly denigrates. He diminishes the importance of the other kind of DMT, which is NN-DMT. And I think part of that is on the basis of this scarcity of 5-MeO-DMT. So he's using the tactic of artificial scarcity, which is what the Catholic Church did in covering up the entheogenic basis of Catholicism. Religious experiences start to look very rare and scarce, and that is part of what the Catholic Church bases its power on. And I think that Ball does a similar thing. He bases the exclusiveness of this theory on it being dependent on access to a very rare entheogen.
Yeah, I didn't realize how rare 5-MeO-DMT was.
I've come across it like 2 or 3 times in my life, and it's very distinct from my point of view just how rare it is. It's like gold dust. It's very hard to find. Whereas, especially in the last 10 years, NN-DMT has become very, very common because one very clever guy on the internet worked out a way to extract it with chemicals that you can just buy in a supermarket. You don't need to have any specialist chemical supply to get them. I actually did a whole episode of the Psychonautica podcast devoted to explaining that particular way of extracting it, but there's no similar extraction method for 5-MeO-DMT. You need to know someone who can get that for you, or you need to have a very good, sophisticated knowledge of chemistry and ability to source rare chemicals. There is a toad that produces it, but there's also a lot of plants that make it, and a lot of the ayahuasca admixtures. There's one called Diplopteris cabrerana, which is one of the most common ayahuasca mixtures. That's actually based on 5-MeO-DMT. So it's quite common in ayahuasca, but then that introduces its own problems in terms of being a relatively unergonomic way to trip hard. You can certainly trip very hard by smoking, much easier than you can by drinking a brew, but the trip is much, much shorter.
Yeah, so Martin's focus on 5-MeO-DMT and elevation of it, while you're talking, I guess it kind of has it has like a hipsterish quality to it, that here's this thing that, well, you wouldn't know about it.
Right.
You wouldn't have heard of, you wouldn't have heard of 5-MeO-DMT, but it's really the best thing there is. Or you wouldn't have had access to it. It has a very, here I have insider knowledge that I'm going to share with you, and put down other people. And I find some of his put downs of other entheogens and other entheogenes, I find them kind of slimy personally, kind of saying, oh well, so and so is so disillusioned that they thought they saw machine elves and things like that. Which, I mean, I have my own critiques of. From the ego death theory standpoint, we would just say, well, this is really metaphor, and that the point is to recognize them as metaphor.
Hoffman he's even written about that explicitly on the Yahoo group, about how many years ago he wrote about how you can translate the concept of machine elves into cybernetic metaphor.
Right. So I suppose we would say that other entheogen spirituality advocates, it's not that they have an ego delusion problem in the sense that Martin Ball means. But that they have a kind of metaphor problem.
Yes, right.
In the way that they understand or conceptualize their experiences.
Nobody gets metaphor. Metaphor savviness is incredibly rare.
And I think we would probably charge Martin Ball with that as well. That he is not metaphor savvy, and that is a limitation of his theorizing and thinking.
Right.
he is relatively, he's interesting and relevant to the ego death theory because he's relatively metaphor free and he speaks the language of ego and ego transcendence. But I think something we've been circling around is he uses concepts that seem familiar from kind of Ken Wilber's theorizing.
Yes.
And other New Age theorists.
He uses their concepts, but then he tries to distance himself from them.
Yeah. If I think you put it maybe in an email that Martin Ball is very he is the product if Ken Wilber had the courage to smoke DMT.
I think I said that in a previous recording. He basically is Ken Wilber on drugs. Oh no, you know what? Or did I say that about Michael Hoffman, actually? Michael Hoffman is Ken Wilber on drugs, because the shape of the two theories is actually very similar.
It's true, and I think it reflects a kind of common, in some ways, a common basis. But that key distinction that we touched on between the ego as, Martin Ball's kind of ego as self-awareness, vagueness, versus the ego as control agent. I think, perhaps one way to build up the case that the ego is best defined as a control agent, it's almost based in the ego death theory that, and in some way you could say is kind of loaded, is a loaded definition of ego because it's almost that is the best description of what the ego, the loss of control is kind of the best, most broad description of what the ego experiences in the altered state. And it's perhaps less interesting and relevant that the ego may experience a lack of self-awareness, or a person may experience a lack of self-awareness and a melding with the physical world. That's certainly an experience reported in various trip reports and mythology of melding with the physical world, which seems to be similar to the non-duality claims.
And I also find that characterization of ego death is much more common than characterizing ego death as control loss. It's much more common to characterize ego death experience as a loss of your sense of self, which sounds similar to saying loss of self-awareness, but people rarely say that it's a loss of self-control.
Right, and I wonder if this is just a feature of the thinking of the ego as self-awareness. I mean, people approaching the psychedelic experience almost kind of with even a vague exposure to that definition of the ego that has been rather prominent in New Age thinking since probably the 60s or more, that's what the ego is. The ego is self-awareness, and that the goal is a non-dual state, which I guess, is there a Sanskrit word, Advaita? Is that the term? Are you familiar with this?
Yeah, it directly translates as not two.
Advaita means not two. And so, that concept has had a relative amount of traction in the West and in New Age thinking since probably the 50s and 60s. So I wonder if people describing their experiences of saying, well, I stopped being aware of myself, and that's what they focus on. I wonder if that's a product of being kind of preloaded, predisposed to describe psychedelics that way.
Oh, that's an interesting point, yeah. Because I'd put it down to not having gone far enough into the psychedelic state and tested the limits of control. But I think that's a equivalent argument to be made as well.
Yeah, it's tricky to know, and it's tricky to know. I'm not interested in getting into the business, just what I castigated Martin Ball for of critiquing other people's experiences. I guess that's why I put more emphasis on how people describe and conceptualize their experiences.
Right, yeah.
But at the same time, it's certainly true that, from the ego death theory standpoint, the real action, and we're really kind of fervent about this, the real action and excitement, the most exciting thing comes from trying to test your self-control power and asking yourself those questions in the altered state and kind of riding that dangerous line of freaking out, of having a max freakout.
Of wondering what is restraining your future self from going crazy.
Yeah, what's stopping it? Yeah, who knows? So asking those sorts of questions, how can you let go, in Martin Bull's terminology? How can you just surrender? Martin, I haven't seen a very good description or read or heard one of Martin describing, well, how do you let go? What does that mean precisely? And how do you keep doing that? He praises people highly for doing that, and kind of puts down people who are, he views as tweaking out or something like that, who haven't let go and they're just not surrendering their ego.
And because he's a possibilist and he hasn't transformed his own model of agency, he completely lacks the concept of postulating a higher controller X and then praying to that controller X, your source of control, for continued viability and stability. He doesn't go into that domain at all.
So Ball's theory of entheogenic experiencing and people using his theory are going to remain unstable, or they're going to remain kind of under threat in the altered state.
Yeah, and they're never going to find the really exciting part. They're never going to get into the inner sanctum of control loss awareness.
And really his surrender and letting go is putting off of confronting self-control seizure, of confronting the implications of the ego not truly being in control. His stated, it seems like Martin Bull really wants people to let their inner energy take control, which for him is God, and he wants, we might say he really wants, eternalism. He wants people to let eternalism be in charge. And he sees the ego as preventing that in everyone's day-to-day life. But he doesn't seem to want to... He doesn't deal with the implications of... Or the... how does one go about letting the ego... Or letting energy be in charge? And what are the consequences of doing that in the altered state? What are the dangers of doing that? I think this is where he then relies upon a kind of therapy model to say, well, we can navigate those dangers through having a therapist around, like me, who can help you process what's going on, and you can adopt these different, actions you can do to mitigate kind of threats. I mean, there's one podcast, it's from a number of years ago at this point, where he describes someone coming over and him doing a therapy session with this person, in which he ends up like sitting on the person's chest and forcing the person to, or encouraging the person to shout as loud as they can to have some sort of effect on their experience of tripping.
It starts to sound quite meditationist type approach, where it's relying on a practical method rather than just relying on loose cog itself.
Yeah, so in that sense, Martin, I think he tries to take over the meditation. He tries to take over contemporary meditation practices, which again shows his links to New Age communities or New Age practices in the US and in the West in general. Whereas, it seems like in effect these practices would put off. I guess what I'm driving at is that this puts off full testing of the limits of self-control.
Yeah,
and in that way, he's also kind of similar to drug-free meditation advocates, in that their mindfulness practices, etc., often put off full true enlightenment, according to the ego death theory, because they're really trying to avoiding encountering. It's like the whole paradigm is meant to avoid encountering the threat of the higher controller being in control of your thoughts, that kind of ticking bomb thought, that what's lying up ahead on my world line, what's going to come down, what am I going to do in the future? By focusing on the present and saying, well, all you can control is the present moment, that way of thinking tries to put off the threat of potential coming control loss in the future.
So for meditationists, there's a kind of two-way push, because on the one hand, their egos are telling them that by meditating every day, they are progressing on the way towards enlightenment. But from the point of view of ego death theory, all that the meditation practice is in fact achieving is perpetually avoiding the real dramatic fireworks control loss experience that you can only get from loose cog.
It's because they demonize and put down holding on to your ego and trying to focus on it and understand it. And they say that, and Martin Ball does this as well. They say, well, someone is being kind of neurotic and focusing on their own self, and you shouldn't focus on your ego because that's the point. We're trying to get away from the ego. Whereas the ego death theory, even though, and this is something I think is sometimes puts people off because it's egodeath.com and ego death weblog. Martin Ball claims that you can't really kill your ego. You can't do that, he says. But instead,
he says kill as if it's an action that you take.
Right? Yeah. You can't do that, says Martin Ball. But I think that the ego death term is in some ways Michael Hoffman took that over from Ken Wilber type communities, and
I think Leary was the first person who wrote about it.
Okay, so Leary wrote about it. I mean, I would expect Leary to be kind of a better writer about it, I suppose. As I said in the past, I'm not very familiar with Leary's writings, but
it got co-opted after that anyway. After the come down from the 60s, when they all had to into the 70s and whatever, and they started using, and it's like you mentioned, the term becomes more ego transcendence or killing the ego rather than ego death.
Right. Yeah. Again, which puts a kind of agency to it, that I'm going to kill my ego, which
Ball is saying you can't kill the ego, but it's kind of redundant saying that anyway, because ego death experience is not something that you do, strictly speaking.
Yeah, strictly speaking, it's the sensation of not having control, the cessation of that familiar sense of being a control agent, or the stepping away from that. I think that, I think one way to build the case that the ego is primarily about control, as I was saying earlier, is in that kind of meta-perception sense that the altered state gives us, that we're able to perceive the ego as a set of patterns or set of mental representations that we have, before initiation, have taken for granted. We've taken for granted that we are controller agents making choices in the world, moving through time and space on our own agency, and plotting a course through an open future in which we really do have multiple paths that we could go down, and not just kind of imagined multiple paths.
So it shows you that you have been assuming that rather than remaining embedded inside the assumption.
Yeah, it shows you that you've been assuming that it's kind of an artificial projection. The mind projects the sense of being an ego control agent.
I've often thought that the word psychedelic means mind manifested. I think that a good description would be assumption manifester. It shows you what your implicit background underlying assumptions are that are invisible to you when you're just in the ordinary state of consciousness.
I think that's right. And really why psychedelic is still a great term, or, understood, as you were saying, an assumption manifester. The sense of becoming aware of the mind as a distinct, and your assumption set as a distinct thing that you can observe from almost outside of it.
Yeah, a disassociated or disembodied perspective on it.
That's right. It's a disassociated one that's kind of set aside from it, looking at it. And I think that also includes, your assumption that what you're perceiving, what's being presented to your senses is the same thing as, basically, the representation layer is the same thing as the referent that is being represented.
The philosopher Kant, he used the term phenomenon and noumenon, that pair of distinctions. The phenomenon is the appearance to consciousness, and the noumenon is the thing independent of the appearance. Right,
which I think altered state experiencing reveals.
It creates that distinction. Normally, you conflate the two together. In the ordinary state of consciousness, that distinction is not apparent. Whereas in the altered state, it becomes apparent that there is the distinction between phenomenon and noumenon.
Yes, and I think that so Martin Ball's theory continues to conflate the two.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
And this is another reason to advocate the ego-death theory's focus on cognitive science and phenomenology and mental model.
Yeah, mental models instead of literal truth, absolute truth.
Which is, I think, then this plays into why Martin rushes in to focus on a therapeutic benefit.
Right. That's like a hiding place for that lack of precision.
Yeah, to say, oh, well, the real goal is all this sort of benefit stuff. I mean, to me, it also kind of ties into his great success, as we mentioned. It seems great success at establishing himself as a entrepreneur figure in the psychedelic entheogen new age therapy community. He's kind of this independent actor. He's not directly tied to an institution like MAPS, and he's not, he's not tied to. He comes from a religious studies background. He's not tied to neuroscience paradigm or anything like that. But he kind of floats in between them and has, is quite, views himself as offering critiques of a number of these positions. He'll say that he critiques, other entheogen people, philosophers and whatnot. So he offers critiques of them in his theory. He also interviews people quite widely on his podcast.
Yes.
So, but I think that I always get this, I do get the sense I'm being sold something from Martin Ball, that I'm being invited to buy into a brand and literally invest my money into something. You can read snippets of a book, but you can't get the whole ideas. You've got to download or you've got to buy the book to get the whole ideas and all the details of the work and things like that.
Right, and the way he italicizes the entheological paradigm reinforces that idea that he has created his own brand.
Yes, yeah, it's like a trademark, Martin Ball sort of thing.
Yeah, it should have a TM after the end of it.
Yeah. But, in some ways, hats off to him in that way. But I think that the constant selling of it, I think, has perhaps affected, I don't know, it certainly affects it seems to affect the theory. It has to be something that seems palpable. And so I think the therapy aspect really enters into that.
Oh, I see. Right. It has a corresponding element in Michael Hoffman's theory, I think, because Michael Hoffman goes to great effort to establish his intellectual priority of discovery, which is somewhat similar to Martin Ball's almost trademarking of the entheological paradigm.
Certainly that's right. Michael's very active in claiming his copyright and his, what precisely his contributions have been.
Yes. His particular connections of ideas that are unique to him, which is primarily metaphor, entheogen, determinism.
Yeah, bringing all of those together. Yeah, so there is an analogy there. Both are West Coast Americans, which is kind of in the mythology of the U.S. and in the culture is a very entrepreneurial sort of place.
Oh, okay.
People go out west to make their fortunes. This is the kind of the attitude of the West.
Right.
The internet startups, the Silicon Valley sort of thing. Like everyone is going to get out there and create their own startup that's going to be successful. And so I think it fits into to a certain extent it fits into the culture of the place.
Well, that's a West Coast tendency. That's an interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, it certainly fits in with. Yeah, I think it does. I think it does fit in with that. It's a West Coast U.S. tendency. Yeah, I'm trying to think what other points we have to make regarding. We're about at the 2-hour mark of recording,
so we should definitely wrap it up. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I've said everything that I particularly had thought of that I wanted to say about Ball. So unless there's anything you wanted to add,
yeah, let me just review some of my notes and maybe just briefly mention the topics as a kind of summary of what we've discussed. And see if you have anything to add at the end. So we discussed... so Ball's theory is it's relevant to discussing the ego-death theory. It's highly relevant because it claims to explain entheogenic experiencing and to explain the ego and the relationship of the ego to what is revealed by the altered state, which the ego death theory also claims to explain what is the what the primary point of entheogenic psychedelic drug experiencing is, and is centrally focused upon what we call the ego. Okay, but then we discuss it from the perspective that Martin Ball is really, even though he discusses other entheogens or mentions them, he is really primarily focused on this one rather rare entheogen, 5-MeO-DMT, which he elevates to the exclusion of others.
In smokable form.
In smokable form, in particular. And he makes the experiences that he has had with that drug the criteria for judging other drug experiences, other entheogenic experiences. Now, from our standpoint, he paints himself into a corner with this, whereas in contrast, as we've come to understand it, the point is more that entheogens, a wide variety of drugs, produce loosened cognition.
Exactly, yeah.
And that is the common, most important function or effect of entheogens across cultures, across time, and across the drugs.
Leading to the experience of determinism.
Yeah, the loose cognition state, produces explicit representationalism of mental constructs, including, and most threateningly, the construct of the ego as control agent moving through time, and the sense of possibilism of steering into an open future reveals that as explicit representationalism, and not instead in the entheogen state, in the loose cog state, the eternalism mental model kind of forces its way in as a powerful and coherent way of thinking and of experiencing time in the self.
So this is the whole cognitive science area which Ball is basically missed out on.
Yes, he basically misses out on it. Instead, basing himself in almost in he bases himself in grand claims about the nature of reality and in non-dualism as primarily defined in modern New Age.
Right.
So, we discussed, and this gets into another topic, we discussed the vulnerability of grand claims, and this claiming to reveal the nature of reality, the evolution of consciousness, the specialty of 5-MeO-DMT, the vagueness of energy,
and the mathematical fractal appeal.
Right, this fractal appeal, which doesn't really seem to have any obvious direct relationship to entheogenic experiencing.
Yeah. Tenuous at best.
And also, in the topic of grand claims lies his grand claims regarding the therapeutic goal of entheogenic experiencing. Yeah, he promises to explain the nature of reality and show you why all previous religious systems and metaphysical systems are bunk, and he promises to give you the techniques to live a radically honest and blissed out life. So it is, from our perspective, rather lumbering and it doesn't really get off the ground, so to speak. Whereas in contrast, our interests in cybernetics and cognitive science, all that the ego death theory asks us for the individual to understand a mental world model of the eternalism mental world model as distinct from the possibilism mental world model, and what that implies for self-control and decision-making.
Yeah.
Yeah, we mentioned the therapeutic goals, that he wants to bring something from the altered state into the ordinary state in order to help people live a kind of, as I mentioned, a radically honest life, a life in harmony with their own inner energy.
And with a higher degree of mindful self-awareness.
Right, a higher degree of mindful self-awareness, which, from our perspective, is that would be great. Those are wonderful, perhaps wonderful things if you want those things, but is really asking a lot of entheogenic experiencing, and is certainly not a criteria of entheogenic experiencing. It's certainly not something you have to try to do, and in fact, seems like a long shot.
Yes, yeah.
we discussed how his conception of the ego is rather vague as just self-consciousness, or it's kind of a moving target. It is, sometimes he describes it as the capacity for self-awareness. Other times he calls it a constricted energetic pattern. Other times it is a...
So it seems he defines it differently according to what he's trying to prove.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Because then other times it is a filter between external energy and internal energy. And other times it is simply defined as that which prevents awakening to non-duality.
Right.
And along with that, his focus on the ego is really about letting go of the ego, and this kind of folk wisdom of surrendering to the experience, and not having a bad trip, not tweaking out and focusing on your ego so much that you start to worry about things. So he really promotes just kind of letting go and trying to remain in a blissed out non-dual state. And he does promote doing some sort of work in the state. He talks about doing work, entheogenic work.
It tends to be quite physically orientated work, like yoga exercises or something like that.
That's right. Yeah, he describes a number of like postures and different exercises, ways of singing or something like that. But he implies or even states that that after we realize our energetic nature and have fully let go of our egos, then we can start controlling our choices in the ordinary state and choose to make choices that are in harmony with our inner energetic nature and not societal identity constructs.
So he clearly wants to combine enlightenment with retention of free will, retention of possibilist world model.
Yes, he does. Yeah, he explicitly talks about that as the goal after enlightenment is to then make better choices in one's day-to-day life. And
so it only increases the amount of freedom you have rather than revealing that you don't have any.
Yeah, so in contrast, the ego death theory would say that after enlightenment, as defined in the ego death theory, we simply realize that every choice we have made and will make, the whole action of making a choice, everything that goes into making a choice, all that deliberation and the action of the will in making that choice, all of that is already preset. I think the ego death theory would state in reply to Ball that we have never been and never could be out of harmony with eternalism in any practical way.
Yes, I see what you mean, yeah.
We can be, I think the ego death theory would state that before enlightenment and initiation, we are out of harmony in that we think we have autonomous choice in the first place.
So it's just that you don't realize your harmony rather than not having harmony.
Yes, and so in that way, the ego death theory is rather disappointing if your goal with using entheogens is to get, a kind of permanent, happy, blissed out, authentic state. Well, not authentic, but a kind of permanent betterment of your choices you make, because it would kind of say, I think the ego death theory would say, well, your choices were fine to begin with in the first place. They were, you couldn't have done anything differently anyway. Everything was predetermined about what you did, and everything is predetermined about what you will do. And so the ego death theory just simply provides a kind of relaxation from anxiety, I guess, about that, but it does not practically, there's no kind of practical immediate benefits that it provides. Besides intellectual coherence and a certain relaxation of anxiety, I think, about making the correct choice or something like that. Though even in the ordinary state, there's going to remain the sense of struggling to make a decision, because all that is built into the space-time block, according to the ego death theory.
Yes, just that you conceive of it differently, but the experience of making decisions remains exactly the same.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And I think one critique people make of determinism as commonly understood as a kind of sequential determinism is that you could just not do anything, and if it were fated that you win the lottery, you could just not do anything ever, and you wouldn't apply yourself ever. But eternalism, as opposed to that sort of fatedness, doesn't is kind of immune to that complaint, because it says that all actions you do are part of the eternally existing space-time block. So there's no kind of, it's not like one action is specifically, the action of winning the lottery or achieving a great prize is itself specially fated. It's more that every single action, every single moment of time slice is set and predetermined and fated. There is no time for choice. There's no time for egoic choice in the way that we commonly conceive of it. Oh yes, and then finally, Martin Ball can't really explain religious myth. He can really only dismiss it. He has some attempts to say, well, other previous systems and other metaphysical systems are trying to describe non-dualism, but they fail and misinterpret it, and so create metaphysical entities. Which there's some validity, I think, in criticizing metaphysical entities and criticizing past religious systems as being inefficient or misleading in some way.
Yeah, because they're not literal and they're not systematic.
Yeah, they're not literal, they're not systematic, but I think any critique of them has to involve a sophisticated understanding of altered state metaphor and double entendre. And Martin Ball does not have that. He does not view religious myth as an analogy for entheogenic experiencing.
Which is actually, it's quite surprising given his background in religious history that he hasn't made that connection.
It is surprising, and I wonder if he has had, if there's some sense he has had too much background in religious history and too much adopted the
academy view of it, the official line.
The official line and official paradigm, such that it requires too many deeply held understandings. It requires changing too many deeply held understandings in a way.
So he's locked into that paradigm. Yeah, I see what you mean. He's locked into the official paradigm. He can't see beyond it.
Right. I mean, that was possible. He could learn to see beyond it, but in a way that could in fact work in his favor in adopting it, because he is it seems quite familiar with lots of past religious systems. But he tends to describe them mostly as exploitative systems designed to trap you into your personal identity and prevent you from seeing non-dualism.
Yeah, so in addition, he doesn't have he doesn't recognize the distinction between exoteric and esoteric religion. That's another hole in his thinking.
Yeah, he focuses on the exoteric and takes that for granted, I think, as the point of past religions.
Right, with all of its negative connotations of exploiting and that kind of thing.
Yeah, he seems to be an enemy of past religious systems and frequently denigrates them rather than striving to explain and incorporate. Though, as I said, I do admit he does some explaining. Entities being projection of ego delusion, but that doesn't really get down to. That's kind of a side light to his overall theory about fractal energy experiencing.
It's an important point because it's mistaken reification of a concept, and he's using. You could apply that to ego, but you can also apply it to these DMT entities.
Yeah, reification is a nice word for it.
Yeah, making something into a concrete thing.
Yeah, when in fact it's not. That's not the intention of. I mean, I suppose that pre-modern religious systems are defined by a fluidness of thinking, and they're less, it seems to me, and including philosophical systems, they're less kind of attached to a more modern idea of there being a fixed definition.
Yeah, a fixed theology.
Mm-hmm, a fixed theology, yeah, and fixed kind of scientific fixed definition. They kind of allow for fluidness of understanding of images and terminology.
Right.
So they allow for that, and so they oftentimes give the appearance, pre-modern religions do give the appearance of reification, and I think that is an issue in the modern era, is that now that many people do not view drugs as part of religious practice, they lack themselves that fluid analogy understanding. The understanding of fluid analogy has fallen out of the modern mindset.
Yes.
Which was something present in the pre-modern religious systems. So it's very tricky in my book, it's very tricky to pin down pre-modern religious systems, in the way that Martin Ball does, and say, well, they're just reifying, they're just creating entities of, out of their own societal ego projections and things like that. It's not clear to me that they're creating entities out of it. Now, you could understand what they're saying, I guess, that way, as many people have done in the modern era, and maybe did in the pre-modern era for reasons of societal exploitation, but it's hard to psychologize them, I think, in the way that Martin Ball does. He tends to psychologize other systems and other people. They're just projecting their ego delusions out onto their experiences.
Right.
So I think that's a good summary, and maybe even some additional new content of Martin Ball's system and our criticisms of it. Do you have something you want to add?
No, I think this has been tremendously thorough. It's quite a sprawling thing, but I don't think we've left anything out. I had a pretty clear idea of all the different ideas that I wanted to incorporate, and I think we've covered it very well.
Yeah, I think I should. I think it might be worthwhile with the podcast. Would it be worthwhile to post? I think Michael mentioned this in email that he has had success in pairing a podcast with even a general overview posting about that podcast.
Oh, okay.
Do you think that would be worthwhile to put on my website? Because, for example, the past one is able to link to my descriptions of my trajectory into the ego-death theory. Would that be worthwhile for future podcasts, do you think?
It would definitely be worth coming up with a... Do you mean before or after the podcast?
I think at the same, kind of posting it at the same time or afterwards. Not so much as a preview, because I do want people to listen to the podcast, and not in a way that eclipses the podcast, but a kind of, I guess maybe a slightly more detailed, almost summary of contents or table of contents or something like that.
Yeah, sure. I didn't think that was so necessary for the first 2 episodes, but I think that will become a lot more. And with this one especially, there's so many points that you could write in a list of bullet points to summarize what this podcast is about. So, yeah, I fully agree. I did think that it's not worth trying to promote it too hard at this early stage. I think my plan was to really start promoting it hard after the 3rd episode hits the internet, because then there's more that people can relate to, more content that people can relate to, rather than just you and I talking about our own very personal journeys.
Yeah, I'm almost envisioning it as a kind of like a season of a TV series, in a way that we can whether if you want to start promoting it more after the 3rd, that's great. Maybe it'd even be better to wait until after this one is ready.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay.
So that there is an example of, we can advertise that here's our substantive take on one of the paradigms.
Yeah, because people will want to listen to that. People will really want to listen to a deconstruction of Martin Ball, I think, far more than who will want to listen to our stories.
Yeah, those are kind of for people who already know us, and for background for people.
And for us to get to know each other.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's right. So yeah, I think we're into the more the real substance of the podcast.
Yes.
At this stage. So yeah, I do feel kind of very thoroughly that we've thoroughly exhausted Martin Ball at the moment. Sorry, Martin.
It gives him room to catch up. It gives him a clear view of where he needs to go to progress from where he is now.
Yeah, I mean, it is worth stating again at the outset that, there are a lot of admirable things about Martin Ball, but that we find his theory of entheogenic experiencing vulnerable, limited, and misses the most exciting points of it.
Yeah. It just doesn't go far enough. It looks so promising, but then it just doesn't deliver the goods when you actually get into the details.
Yeah, it is very promising, and it stops short at this non-duality experience, which is great. Non-duality is fine and great, and I'll admit that I've had experiences where I felt, had that sort of realization on, or experience that sort of thinking about, well, and, everything is one, etc. And it's really neat feeling. And I've experienced myself melding into my surroundings and had that idea that, barriers are dropping or something like that. But that's great and wonderful, but that's not the end-all, be-all of entheogenic experiencing. That's where I would challenge Martin Ball.
It's like you said, we need to show him the direction into the inner sanctum of hardcore entheogen experiencing and world model transformation.
I know. Get out of, I just think don't focus on the therapy. Yeah, don't focus on the therapy. If you really want to get to the kind of most extreme or most fun in certain ways experiencing and the most relevant, profound experiencing, you can't focus on therapy or on explaining the nature of reality. You've got to get with the mental representations, the mental world models, and specifically the self as control agent. And what are the limits of that in the altered state?
I think his focus could be a symptom of what Michael Hoffman said about how fame and popularity is like a necessary evil, and maybe that the direction of his theorizing is in some way a result of his looking for fame and popularity at an early stage, by trying to give things that appeal to people, like promises of therapeutic benefits.
Yeah, it would be interesting to look. I have his Salvia Divinorum book, but that Salvia book and the Mushroom book were written before he engaged in this entheological paradigm project.
Yeah.
Which, they certainly have a kind of self-help in the sense of here's how to use, or here's how, here's a guidebook to using these drugs as I understand them. Is that your understanding of those two books?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the focus is only fairly gentle when it comes to the self-help aspect of it. But yeah, I do see what you mean. It's a practical guide for using salvia and mushrooms.
Right, which is a valuable contribution in many ways, but it perhaps reveals the tendency or the drive of his thinking, that he wants to provide this sort of self-help to the community of psychedelic explorers, for which he has done a lot of other activities.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think maybe we should wrap this up at this stage. Do we want to decide upon the next topic, or should we give, write each other in a day or two or something like that? Give some time to mull it over. I've been thinking so much about Martin Ball. I've just got him on the brain right now. I haven't thought anything about the next one. So I think, best idea, give that a day or two and then reconvene by email. Yeah, that's. I think that's a good idea. See where our kind of relax out of Martin Ball's world and see where. Yeah, we've done that now. Yeah. Which was something we had on our minds before from the very beginning. So I think we should let that relax and see where we want to go next.